Chapter 36 of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 36. The Bath. At Verlaines, beneath the impenetrable shade of flowering osiers and willows, which, as they bent down their green heads, dipped the extremities of their branches in the blue waters, a long and flat-bottomed boat, with ladders covered with long blue curtains, served as a refuge for the bathing Dianas, who, as they left the water, were watched by 20 plumed Acteons, who, eagerly and full of admiration, galloped up and down the flowery banks of the river. But Diana herself, even the chaste Diana, clothed in her long chlamys, was less beautiful, less impenetrable, than Madame, as young and beautiful as that goddess herself. For, notwithstanding the fine tunic of the huntress, her round and delicate knees can be seen, and notwithstanding the sonorous quiver, her brown shoulders can be detected, whereas, in Madame's case, a long white veil enveloped her, wrapping her round and round 100 times, as she resigned herself into the hands of her female attendants, and thus was rendered inaccessible to the most indiscreet, as well as to the most penetrating gaze. When she ascended the ladder, the poets were present, and all were poets when Madame was the subject of discussion. The 20 poets who were galloping about, stopped, and with one voice exclaimed that pearls, and not drops of water, were falling from her person, to be lost again in the happy river. The king, the centre of these effusions, and of this respectful homage, imposed silence upon these expectators, for whom it seemed impossible to exhaust their raptures, and he rode away, for fear of offending, even through the silk curtains, the modesty of the woman and the dignity of the princess. A great blank therefore ensued in the scene, and perfect silence in the boat. From the movements on board, from the flutterings and agitation of the curtains, the goings to and fro of the female attendants engaged in their duties could be guessed. The king smilingly listened to the conversation of the courtiers around him, but it could easily be perceived that he gave but little, if any, attention to their remarks. In fact, hardly had the sound of the rings drawn along the curtain rods announced that Madame was dressed, and that the goddess was about to make her reappearance, than the king, returning to his former post immediately, and running quite close to the river bank, gave the signal for all those to approach whose duty or pleasure summoned them to Madame's side. The pages rushed forward, conducting the led horses; the carriages, which had remained sheltered under the trees, advanced towards the tent, followed by a crowd of servants, bearers, and female attendants, who, while their masters had been bathing, had mutually exchanged their own observations, critical remarks, and the discussions of matters personal, the fugitive journal of that period, of which no one now remembers anything, not even by the waves, the witnesses of what went on that day, themselves now sublimated into immensity, as the actors have vanished into eternity. A crowd of people swarming upon the banks of the river, without reckoning the groups of peasants drawn together by their anxiety to see the king and the princess, was, for many minutes, the most disorderly, but the most agreeable mob imaginable. The king dismounted from his horse, a movement which was imitated by all the courtiers, and offered his hat to Madame, whose rich riding habit displayed her fine figure, which was set off to great advantage by that garment, made of fine woolen cloth embroidered with silver. Her hair, still damp and blacker than jet, hung in heavy masses upon her white and delicate neck. Joy and health sparkled in her beautiful eyes. Composed, yet full of energy, she inhaled the air in deep draughts, under a lace parasol, which was borne by one of her pages. Nothing could be more charming, more graceful, more poetic, than these two figures buried under the rose-colored shade of the parasol. The king, whose white teeth were displayed in continual smiles, and Madame, whose black eyes sparkled like carbuncles in the glittering reflections of the changing hues of the silk. When Madame approached her horse, a magnificent animal of Andalusian breed, of spotless white, somewhat heavy perhaps, but with a spirited and splendid head, in which the mixture, happily combined, of Arabian and Spanish blood could be readily traced, and whose long tail swept the ground, and as the princess affected difficulty in mounting, the king took her in his arms in such a manner that Madame's arm was clasped, like a circlet of alabaster, around the king's neck. Louis, as he withdrew, involuntarily touched with his lips the arm, which was not withheld, and the princess having thanked her royal equerry, everyone sprang to his saddle at the same moment. The king and Madame drew aside to allow the carriages, the outriders, and runners to pass by, released from the restraint etiquette had imposed upon them, gave the rein to their horses, and darted after the carriages which bore the maids of honor, as blooming as so many virgin huntresses around Diana, and the human whirlwind, laughing, chattering, and noisy, passed onward. The king and Madame, however, kept their horses in hand at a foot pace. Behind his majesty and his sister-in-law, certain of the courtiers, those, at least, who were seriously disposed or were anxious to be within reach, or under the eyes of the king, followed at a respectful distance, restraining their impatient horses, regulating their pace by that of the king and Madame, and abandoned themselves to all the delight and gratification which is to be found in the conversation of clever people, who can, with perfect courtesy, make 1,000 atrocious but laughable remarks about their neighbors. In their stifled laughter, and in the little reticences of their sardonic humor, Monsieur, the poor absentee, was not spared. But they pitied and bewailed greatly the fate of De Guiche, and it must be confessed that their compassion, as far as he was concerned, was not misplaced. The king and Madame having breathed the horses, and repeated 100 times over such remarks as the courtiers, who supplied them with talk, suggested to them, set off at a hand gallop, and the leafy coverts of the forest resounded to the footfalls of the mounted party, to the conversations beneath the shade of the trees, to remarks made in the shape of confidential communications and observations, mysteriously exchanged, succeeded the noisiest bursts of laughter. From the very outriders to royalty itself, merriment seemed to spread. Every one began to laugh and to cry out. The magpies and the jays fluttering away uttered their guttural cries beneath the waving avenues of oaks. The cuckoo stayed his monotonous cry in the recesses of the forest. The chaffinch and tomtit flew away in the clouds, while the terrified deer bounded riverwards from the midst of the thickets. The crowd, spreading joy, confusion, and light wherever it passed, was heralded, it may be said, to the chateau by its own clamor. As the king and Madame entered the village, they were received by the acclamations of the crowd. Madame hastened to look for Monsieur, for she instinctively understood that he had been far too long kept from sharing in this joy. The king went to rejoin the queens. He knew he owed them, one especially, a compensation for his long absence. But Madame was not admitted to Monsieur's apartments, and she was informed that Monsieur was asleep. The king, instead of being met by Maria Theresa smiling, as was usual with her, found Anne of Austria in the gallery waiting for his return, who advanced to meet him, and taking him by the hand, led him to her own apartment. No one ever knew what was the nature of the conversation which took place between them, or rather what it was that the queen mother said to Louis XIV., but the general tenor of the interview might certainly be guessed from the annoyed expression of the king's face as he left her. But we, whose mission it is to interpret all things, as it is also to communicate our interpretation to our readers, we should fail in our duty if we were to leave them in ignorance of the results of this interview. It will be found sufficiently detailed, at least we hope so, in the following chapter. End of chapter 36. Recording by Todd. 7 of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 years later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 37. The Butterfly Chase. The king, on retiring to his apartments to give some directions and to arrange his ideas, found in his toilette glass a small note, the handwriting of which seemed disguised. He opened it and read, "Come quickly, I have 1,000 things to say to you." The king and Madame had not been separated a sufficiently long time for these 1,000 things to be the result of the 3,000 which they had been saying to each other during the route which separated Vernier from Fontainebleau. The confused and hurried character of the note gave the king a great deal to reflect upon. He occupied himself but slightly with his toilette, and set off to pay his visit to Madame. The princess, who did not wish to have the appearance of expecting him, had gone into the gardens with the ladies of her suite. When the king was informed that Madame had left her apartments, and had gone for a walk in the gardens, he collected all the gentlemen he could find, and invited them to follow him. He found Madame engaged in chasing butterflies, on a large lawn bordered with heliotrope and flowering broom. She was looking on as the most adventurous and youngest of her ladies ran to and fro, and with her back turned to a high hedge, very impatiently awaited the arrival of the king, with whom she had appointed the rendezvous. The sound of many feet upon the gravel walk made her turn round. Louis XIV was hatless. He had struck down with his cane a peacock butterfly, which Monsieur de Saint Aignan had picked up from the ground, quite stunned. "You see, madame," said the king as he approached her, "that I, too, am hunting on your behalf." And then, turning towards those that had accompanied him, said, "Gentlemen, see if each of you cannot obtain as much for these ladies," a remark which was a signal for all to retire. And thereupon a curious spectacle might have been observed. Old and corpulent courtiers were seen running after butterflies, losing their hats as they ran, and with their raised canes cutting down the myrtles and the firs, as they would have done the Spaniards. The king offered Madame his arm, and they both selected, as the centre of observation, a bench with a roof of boards and moss, a kind of hut roughly designed by the modest genius of one of the gardeners who had inaugurated the picturesque and fanciful amid the formal style of the gardening of that period. This sheltered retreat, covered with nasturtiums and climbing roses, screened the bench, so that the spectators, insulated in the middle of the lawn, saw and were seen on every side, but could not be heard, without perceiving those who might approach for the purpose of listening. Seated thus, the king made a sign of encouragement to those who were running about, and then, as if he was engaged with Madame in a dissertation upon the butterfly, which he had thrust through with a gold pin and fastened on his hat, said to her, "How admirably we are placed here for conversations!" "Yes, sire, for I wish to be heard by you alone, and yet to be seen by every one." "And I also," said Louis. "My note surprised you?" "Terrified me rather, but what I have to tell you is more important." "It cannot be, sire. Do you know that Monsieur refuses to see me?" "Why so?" "Can you not guess why?" "Ah, madame, in that case we have both the same thing to say to each other." "What has happened to you, then?" "You wish me to begin?" "Yes, for I have told you all." "Well, then, as soon as I returned, I found my mother waiting for me, and she led me away to her own apartments." "The queen mother?" said Madame, with some anxiety. "The matter is serious, then." "Indeed it is, for she told me. But in the first place allow me to preface what I am about to say with one remark. Has Monsieur ever spoken to you about me?" "Often." "Has he ever spoken to you about his jealousy?" "More frequently still." "Of his jealousy of me?" "No, but of the Duke of Buckingham and De Guiche." "Well, madame, Monsieur's present idea is a jealousy of myself." "Really?" replied the princess, smiling archly. "And it seems to me," continued the king, "that we have never given any ground—" "Never! At least I have not. But who told you that Monsieur was jealous?" "My mother represented to me that Monsieur entered her apartments like a madman, that he uttered 1,000 complaints against you, and, forgive me for saying it, against your coquetry. It seems that Monsieur indulges in injustice, too." "You are very kind, sire." "My mother reassured him, but he pretended that people reassure him too often, and that he had had quite enough of it." "Would it not be better for him not to make himself uneasy in any way?" "The very thing I said." "Confess, sire, that the world is very wicked. Is it possible that a brother and sister cannot converse together, or take pleasure in each other's company, without giving rise to remarks and suspicions? For indeed, sire, we are doing no harm, and have no intention of doing any." And she looked at the king with that proud yet provoking glance that kindles desire in the coldest and wisest of men. "No," sighed the king, "that is true." "You know very well, sire, that if it were to continue, I should be obliged to make a disturbance. Do you decide upon our conduct, and say whether it has, or has not, been perfectly correct." "Oh, certainly, perfectly correct." "Quite often together, for we delight in the same things, we might possibly be led away into error, but have we been? I regard you as a brother, and nothing more." The king frowned. She continued, "Your hand, which often meets my own, does not excite in me that agitation and emotion which is the case with those who love each other, for instance." "Enough," said the king, "enough, I entreat you." "You have no pity. You are killing me." "What is the matter?" "In fact, then, you distinctly say you experience nothing when near me?" "Oh, sire, I didn't say that. My affection—" "Enough, Henrietta, I again entreat you. If you believe me to be marble, as you are, undeceive yourself." "I do not understand you, sire." "Very well," said the king, casting down his eyes. "And so our meetings, the pressure of each other's hands, the looks we have exchanged. Yes, yes, you are right, and I understand your meaning." And he buried his face in his hands. "Take care, sire," said Madame, hurriedly. "Monsieur Saint Aignan is looking at you." "Of course," said Louis, angrily. "Never even the shadow of liberty, never any sincerity in my intercourse with any one. I imagine I have found a friend, who is nothing but a spy; a dearer friend, who is only a sister." Madame was silent, and cast down her eyes. "My husband is jealous," she murmured, in a tone of which nothing could equal its sweetness and charm. "You are right," exclaimed the king, suddenly. "You see," she said, looking at him in a manner that set his heart on fire, "you are free, you are not suspected, the peace of your house is not disturbed." "Alas!" said the king, "as yet you know nothing, for the queen is jealous." "Maria Theresa?" "Stark mad with jealousy. Monsieur's jealousy rises from hers. She was weeping and complaining to my mother, and was reproaching us for those bathing parties, which have made me so happy." "And me too," answered Madame by a look. "When suddenly," continued the king, "Monsieur, who was listening, heard the word manos, which the queen pronounced with some degree of bitterness, that awakened his attention. He entered the room, looking quite wild, broke into the conversation, and began to quarrel with my mother so bitterly that she was obliged to leave him. So that, while you have a jealous husband to deal with, I shall have perpetually present before me a spectre of jealousy with swollen eyes, a cadaverous face, and sinister looks." "Poor king!" murmured Madame, as she lightly touched the king's hand. He retained her hand in his, and in order to press it without exciting suspicion in the spectators, who were not so much taken up with the butterflies that they could not occupy themselves about other matters, and who perceived clearly enough that there was some mystery in the king's and Madame's conversation, Louis placed the dying butterfly before his sister-in-law, and bent over it as if to count the thousand eyes of its wings, or the particles of golden dust which covered it. Neither of them spoke. However, their hair mingled, their breaths united, and their hands fervently throbbed in each other's grasp. 5 minutes passed in this manner. Chapter 37. Recording by Todd.
"10 years later." This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Neeland. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. What was caught after the butterflies. The two young people remained for a moment with their heads bent down, bowed, as it were, beneath the double thought of the love which was springing up in their hearts, and which gives birth to so many happy fancies in the imaginations of 20 years of age. Henrietta gave a side glance from time to time at the king. Hers was one of those finely organized natures capable of looking inwardly at itself, as well as at others, at the same moment. She perceived love lying at the bottom of Louis's heart, as a skillful diver sees a pearl at the bottom of the sea. She knew Louis was hesitating, if not in doubt, and that his indolent or timid heart required aid and encouragement. "And so," she said, interrogatively, breaking the silence. "What do you mean?" inquired Louis, after a moment's pause. "I mean that I shall be obliged to return to the resolution I had formed." "To what resolution?" "To that which I have already submitted to your Majesty." "When?" "On the very day we had a certain explanation about Monsieur's jealousies." "What did you say to me then?" inquired Louis, with some anxiety. "Do you not remember, sire?" "Alas, if it be another cause of unhappiness, I shall recollect it soon enough." "A cause of unhappiness for myself alone, sire," replied Madame Henrietta, "but as it is necessary, I must submit to it." "At least tell me what it is," said the king. "Absence." "Still that unkind resolve?" "Believe me, sire, I have not found it without a violent struggle with myself. It is absolutely necessary I should return to England." "Never, never will I permit you to leave France!" exclaimed the king. "And yet, sire," said Madame, affecting a gentle yet sorrowful determination, "nothing is more urgently necessary. Nay, more than that, I am persuaded it is your mother's desire I should do so." "Desire!" exclaimed the king. "That is a very strange expression to use to me." "Still," replied Madame Henrietta, smilingly, "are you not happy in submitting to the wishes of so good a mother?" "Enough, I implore you. You rend my very soul." "I?" "Yes, for you speak of your departure with tranquillity." "I was not born for happiness, sire," replied the princess dejectedly, "and I acquired in very early life the habit of seeing my dearest wishes disappointed." "Do you speak truly?" said the king. "Would your departure gainsay any one of your cherished thoughts?" "If I were to say yes, would you begin to take your misfortune patiently?" "How cruel you are!" "Take care, sire. Someone is coming." The king looked all around him and said, "No, there is no one," and then continued, "Come, Henrietta, instead of trying to contend against Monsieur's jealousy by a departure which would kill me—" Henrietta slightly shrugged her shoulders like a woman unconvinced. "Yes," repeated Louis, "which would kill me, I say. Instead of fixing your mind on this departure, does not your imagination, or rather does not your heart, suggest some expedient?" "What is it you wish my heart to suggest?" Tell me, how can one prove to another that it is wrong to be jealous? In the first place, sire, by giving no motive for jealousy. In other words, in loving no one but the person in question. Oh, I expected more than that. What did you expect? That you would simply tell me that jealous people are pacified by concealing the affection which is entertained for the object of jealousy. Dissimulation is difficult, sire. Yet it is only by means of conquering difficulties that any happiness is attained. As far as I am concerned, I swear I will give the lie to those who are jealous of me by pretending to treat you like any other woman. A bad as well as unsafe means, said the young princess, shaking her pretty head. You seem to think everything bad, dear Henrietta, said Louise, discontentedly. You negative everything I propose. Suggest at least something else in its stead. Come, try and think. I trust implicitly to a woman's invention. Do you invent in your turn? Well, sire, I have hit upon something. Will you listen to it? Can you ask me? You speak of a matter of life and death to me, and then ask if I will listen. Well, I judge of it by my own case. If my husband intended to put me on the wrong scent with regard to another woman, one thing would reassure me more than anything else. What would that be? In the first place, to see that he never took any notice of the woman in question. Exactly. That is precisely what I said just now. Very well. But in order to be perfectly reassured on the subject, I should like to see him occupy himself with someone else. Ah, I understand you, replied Louise, smiling. But confess, dear Henrietta, if the means is at least ingenious, it is hardly charitable. Why so? In curing the dread of a wound in a jealous person's mind, you inflict one upon the heart. His fear ceases, it is true, but the evil still exists, and that seems to me to be far worse. Agreed. But he does not detect, he does not suspect the real enemy. He does no prejudice to love itself. He concentrates all his strength on the side where his strength will do no injury to anything or any one. In a word, sire, my plan, which I confess I am surprised to find you dispute, is mischievous to jealous people, it is true, but to lovers it is full of advantage. Besides, let me ask, sire, who, except yourself, has ever thought of pitying jealous people? Are they not a melancholy crew of grumblers, always equally unhappy, whether with or without a cause? You may remove that cause, but you never can remove their sufferings. It is a disease which lies in the imagination, and like all imaginary disorders, it is incurable. By the by, I remember an aphorism upon this subject of poor Dr. Dawley, a clever and amusing man, who, had it not been for my brother, who could not do without him, I should have with me now. He used to say, whenever you are likely to suffer from two affections, choose that which will give you the least trouble, and I will allow you to retain it, for it is positive, he said, that that very ailment is of the greatest service to me, in order to enable me to get rid of the other. Well and judiciously remarked, Henrietta, replied the king, smiling. Oh, we have some clever people in London, sire. And those clever people produce adorable pupils. I will grant this Daily, Darley, Dawley, or whatever you call him, a pension for his aphorism. But I entreat you, Henrietta, to begin by choosing the least of your evils. You do not answer, you smile. I guess that the least of your bugbears is your stay in France. I will allow you to retain this information, and, in order to begin with the cure of the other, I will this very day begin to look out for a subject which shall divert the attention of the jealous members of either sex who persecute us both. Hush! This time someone is really coming, said Madame. And she stooped to gather a flower from the thick grass at her feet. Someone, in fact, was approaching, for suddenly a bevy of young girls ran down from the top of the hillock, following the cavaliers, the cause of this interruption being a magnificent hawk moth, with wings like rose leaves. The prey in question had fallen into the net of Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, who displayed it with some pride to her less successful rivals. The queen of the chase had seated herself some 20 paces from the bank on which Louis and Madame Henrietta were reclining, and leaned her back against a magnificent oak tree, entwined with ivy, and stuck the butterfly on the long cane she carried in her hand. Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente was very beautiful, and the gentlemen accordingly deserted her companions, and under the pretext of complimenting her upon her success, pressed in a circle around her. The king and princess looked gloomily at this scene, as spectators of maturer age look on at the games of little children. "They seem to be amusing themselves there," said the king. "Greatly, sire. I have always found that people are amused wherever youth and beauty are to be found." "What do you think of Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, Henrietta?" inquired the king. "I think she has rather too much flax yellow and lily whiteness in her complexion," replied Madame, fixing in a moment upon the only fault it was possible to find in the almost perfect beauty of the future Madame de Montespan. "Rather too fair, yes, but beautiful, I think, in spite of that." "Is that your opinion, sire?" "Yes, really." "Very well, and it is mine too." "And she seems to be much sought after." "On that is a matter of course. Lovers flutter from one to another. If we had hunted for lovers instead of butterflies, you can see, from those who surround her, what successful sport we should have had. Tell me, Henrietta, what would be said if the king were to make himself one of those lovers and let his glance fall in that direction? Would someone else be jealous in such a case?" "Oh, sire, Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente is a very efficacious remedy," said Madame with a sigh. "She would cure a jealous man, certainly, but she might possibly make a woman jealous too." "Henrietta," exclaimed Louise, "you fill my heart with joy. Yes, yes, Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente is far too beautiful to serve as a cloak." "A king's cloak," said Madame Henrietta, smiling, "ought to be beautiful." "Do you advise me to do it, then?" inquired Louise. "I? What should I say, sire, except that to give such an advice would be to supply arms against myself. It would be folly or pride to advise you to take, for the heroine of an assumed affection, a woman more beautiful than the one for whom you pretend to feel real regard." The king tried to take Madame's hand in his own. His eyes sought hers, and then he murmured a few words so full of tenderness, but pronounced in so low a tone, that the historian, who ought to hear everything, could not hear them. Then, speaking aloud, he said, "Do you yourself choose for me the one who is to cure our jealous friend? To her, then, all my devotion, all my attention, all the time that I can spare from my occupations shall be devoted. For her shall be the flower that I may pluck for you, the fond thoughts with which you have inspired me. Towards her I will direct the glance I dare not bestow upon you, and which ought to be able to rouse you from your indifference. But be careful in your selection, lest, in offering her the rose which I may have plucked, I find myself conquered by you, and my looks, my hand, my lips turn immediately towards you, even were the whole world to guess my secret." While these words escaped from the king's lips in a stream of wild affection, Madame blushed, breathless, happy, proud, almost intoxicated with delight. She could find nothing to say in reply. Her pride and her thirst for homage were satisfied. "I shall fail," she said, raising her beautiful black eyes, "but not as you beg me, for all this incense which you wish to burn on the altar of another divinity. Ah, sire, I too shall be jealous of it, and want restored to me, and would not that a particle of it should be lost in the way. Therefore, sire, with your royal permission, I will choose one who shall appear to me the least likely to distract your attention, and who will leave my image intact and unshadowed in your heart." "Happily for me," said the king, "your heart is not hard and unfeeling. If it were so, I should be alarmed at the threat you hold out. Precautions were taken on this point, and around you, as around myself, it would be difficult to meet with a disagreeable-looking face." Whilst the king was speaking, Madame had risen from her seat, looked around the greensward, and after a careful and silent examination, she called the king to her side, and said, "See yonder, sire, upon the declivity of that little hill, near that group of Guelder roses, that beautiful girl walking alone, her head down, her arms hanging by her side, with her eyes fixed upon the flowers, which she crushes beneath her feet, like one who is lost in thought. Mademoiselle de Valier, do you mean? Remarked the king. Yes. Oh! Will she not suit you, sire? Why, look how thin the poor child is. She has hardly any flesh upon her bones. Nay, am I stout then? She is so melancholy. The greater contrast to myself, who am accused of being too lively. She is lame. Do you really think so? No doubt of it. Look, she has allowed every one to pass by her, through fear of her defect being remarked. Well, she will not run as fast as Daphne, and will not be as able to escape Apollo. Henrietta, said the king, out of temper, of all your maids of honor, you have really selected for me the one most full of defects. Still, she is one of my maids of honor. Of course. But what do you mean? I mean that, in order to visit this new divinity, you will not be able to do so without paying a visit to my apartments, and that, as propriety will forbid your conversing with her in private, you will be compelled to see her in my circle, to speak, as it were, at me while speaking to her. I mean, in fact, that those who may be jealous will be wrong if they suppose you come to my apartments for my sake, since you will go there for Mademoiselle de la Valliere. Who happens to be lame. Hardly that. Who never opens her lips, but who, when she does open them, displays a beautiful set of teeth. Who may serve as a model for an osteologist. Your favor will change her appearance. Henrietta, at all events you allowed me to choose. Alas, yes. Well, my choice is made. I impose her upon you, and you must submit. Oh, I would accept one of the Furies if you were to insist upon it. La Valliere is as gentle as a lamb. Do not fear she will ever contradict you when you tell her you love her, said Madame, laughing. You are not afraid, are you, that I shall say too much to her? It would be for my sake. The treaty is agreed to, then. Not only so, but signed. You will continue to show me the friendship of a brother, the attention of a brother, the gallantry of a monarch, will you not? I will preserve for you intact a heart that has already become accustomed to beat only at your command. Very well. Do you not see that we have guaranteed the future by this means? I hope so. Will your mother cease to regard me as an enemy? Yes. Will Maria Theresa leave off speaking in Spanish before Monsieur, who has a horror of conversation held in foreign languages, because he always thinks he is being ill spoken of? And lastly, continued the princess, will people persist in attributing a wrongful affection to the king, when the truth is we can offer nothing to each other except absolute sympathy, free from mental reservation? Yes, yes, said the king, hesitatingly, but other things may still be said of us. What can be said, sire? Shall we never be left in tranquillity? People will say I am deficient in taste, but what is my self-respect in comparison with your tranquillity? In comparison with my honor, sire, and that of our family, you mean. Besides, I beg you to attend. Do not be so hastily prejudiced against La Valliere. She is slightly lame, it is true, but she is not deficient in good sense. Moreover, all that the king touches is converted into gold. Well, madame, rest assured of one thing, namely, that I am still grateful to you. You might even yet make me pay dearer for your stay in France. Sire, someone approaches. Well, one last word. Say it. You are prudent and judicious, sire, but in the present instance you will be obliged to summon to your aid all your prudence and all your judgment. Oh, exclaimed Louise, laughing, from this very day I shall begin to act my part, and you shall see whether I am not quite fit to represent the character of a tender swain. After luncheon there will be a promenade in the forest, and then there is supper and the ballet at 10 o'clock. I know it. The ardor of my passion shall blaze more brilliantly than the fireworks, shall shine more steadily than our friend Colbert's lamps. It shall shine so dazzlingly that the queens and monsieur will be almost blinded by it. Take care, sire, take care. In heaven's name, what have I done, then? I shall begin to recall the compliments I paid you just now. You prudent, you wise, did I say? Why, you begin by the most reckless inconsistencies. Can a passion be kindled in this manner, like a torch, in a moment? Can a monarch, such as you are, without any preparation, fall at the feet of a girl like La Valliere? Ah, Henrietta, now I understand you. We have not yet begun the campaign, and you are plundering me already. No, I am only recalling you to common sense ideas. Let your passion be kindled gradually, instead of allowing it to burst forth so suddenly. Jove's thunders and lightnings are heard and seen before the palace is set on fire. Everything has its commencements. If you are so easily excited, no one will believe you are really captivated, and everyone will think you out of your senses, if even, indeed, the truth itself not be guessed. The public is not so fatuous as they seem. The king was obliged to admit that Madame was an angel for sense, and the very reverse for cleverness. He bowed and said, "Agreed, Madame, I will think over my plan of attack. Great military men, my cousin de Conde, for instance, grow pale in meditation upon their strategical plans, before they move one of their pawns, which people call armies. I therefore wish to draw up a complete plan of campaign, for you know that the tender passion is subdivided in a variety of ways. Well, then, I shall stop at the village of little attentions, at the hamlet of love letters, before I follow the road of visible affection. The way is clear enough, you know, and poor Madame de Scudéry would never forgive me for passing through a halting place without stopping." "Oh, now we have returned to our proper senses, shall we say adieu, sire?" "Alas, it must be so, for see, we are interrupted." "Yes, indeed," said Henrietta. "They are bringing Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente and her Sphinx butterfly in grand procession this way. It is perfectly well understood that this evening, during the promenade, I am to make my escape into the forest and find La Valliere without you. I will take care to send her away." "Very well. I will speak to her when she is with her companions, and I will then discharge my first arrow at her." "Be skillful," said Madame, laughing, "and do not miss the heart." Then the princess took leave of the king, and went forward to meet the merry troop, which was advancing with much ceremony, and a great many pretended flourishes of trumpets imitated with their mouths. End of chapter 38. What was caught after the butterflies. Recording by Bill Neeland. 39 of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Neeland. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. The Ballet of the Seasons. At the conclusion of the banquet, which was served at 5 o'clock, the king entered his cabinet, where his tailors were awaiting him for the purpose of trying on the celebrated costume representing spring, which was the result of so much imagination, and had cost so many efforts of thought to the designers and ornament workers of the court. As for the ballet itself, every person knew the part he had to take in it, and how to perform it. The king had resolved to make it surprise. Hardly, therefore, had he finished his conference, and entered his own apartment, than he desired his two masters of ceremonies, Villeroy and Saint-Aignan, to be sent for. Both replied that they only awaited his orders, and that everything was ready to begin, but that it was necessary to be sure of fine weather and a favorable night before these orders could be carried out. The king opened his window. The pale gold hues of the evening were visible on the horizon through the vistas of the wood, and the moon, white as snow, was already mounting the heavens. Not a ripple could be noticed on the surface of the green waters. The swans themselves, even, reposing, with folded wings, like ships at anchor, seemed inspirations of the warmth of the air, the freshness of the water, and the silence of the beautiful evening. The king, having observed all these things, and contemplated the magnificent picture before him, gave the order which de Villeroy and de Saint-Aignan awaited. But with a view of ensuring the execution of this order in a royal manner, one last question was necessary, and Louis XIV put it to the two gentlemen in the following manner: "Have you any money?" "Sire," replied Saint-Aignan, "we have arranged everything with Monsieur Colbert." "Ah, very well.
"Yes, sire, and Monsieur Colbert said he would await upon your Majesty as soon as your Majesty should manifest an intention of carrying out the fête, of which he has furnished the programme."
"Let him come in, then," said the king, and as if Colbert had been listening at the door for the purpose of keeping himself au courant with the conversation, he entered as soon as the king had pronounced his name to the two courtiers. "Ah, Monsieur Colbert," said the king. "Gentlemen, to your posts," whereupon Saint Aignan and Villeroy took their leave. The king seated himself in an easy chair near the window, saying, "The ballet will take place this evening, Monsieur Colbert." "In that case, sire, I will pay all accounts tomorrow." "Why so?" "I promised the tradespeople to pay their bills on the day following that on which the ballet should take place." "Very well, Monsieur Colbert, pay them, since you have promised to do so." "Certainly, sire, but I must have money to do that." "What? Have not the 4 millions which Monsieur Fouquet promised been sent?" "I forgot to ask you about it." "Sire, they were sent at the hour promised." "Well?" "Well, sire, the colored lamps, the fireworks, the musicians, and the cooks have swallowed up 4 millions in 8 days." "Entirely?" "To the last penny. Every time your Majesty directed the banks of the Grand Canal to be illuminated, as much oil was consumed as there was water in the basins." "Well, well, Monsieur Colbert, the fact is, then, you have no more money." "I have no more, sire, but Monsieur Fouquet has," Colbert replied, his face darkening with a sinister expression of pleasure. "What do you mean?" inquired Louis. "We have already made Monsieur Fouquet advance 6 millions. He has given them with too much grace not to have others still to give, if they are required, which is the case at the present moment. It is necessary, therefore, that he should comply." The king frowned. "Monsieur Colbert," said he, accentuating the financier's name, "that is not the way I understood the matter. I do not wish to make use, against any of my servants, of a means of pressure which may oppress him and fetter his services. In 8 days, Monsieur Fouquet has furnished 6 millions. That is a good round sum." Colbert turned pale. "And yet," he said, "your Majesty did not use this language some time ago, when the news about Belle Isle arrived, for instance." "You are right, Monsieur Colbert." "Nothing, however, has changed since then. On the contrary, indeed." "In my thoughts, monsieur, everything has changed." "Does your Majesty, then, no longer believe the disloyal attempt?" "My affairs concern myself alone, monsieur, and I have already told you I transact them without interference." "Then I perceive," said Colbert, trembling with anger and fear, "that I have had the misfortune to fall into disgrace with your Majesty." "Not at all. You are, on the contrary, most agreeable to me." "Yet, sire," said the minister, with a certain affected bluntness, so successful when it was a question of flattering Louis's self-esteem, "what use is there in being agreeable to your Majesty if one can no longer be of any use? I reserve your services for a better occasion, and, believe me, they will only be the better appreciated." "Your Majesty's plan, then, in this affair is— You want money, Monsieur Colbert?" 700,000 francs, sire." "You will take them from my private treasure." Colbert bowed, "and," added Louis, "as it seems a difficult matter for you, notwithstanding your economy, to defray with so limited a sum the expenses which I tend to incur, I will at once sign an order for 3 millions." The king took a pen and signed an order immediately, then handed it to Colbert. "Be satisfied, Monsieur Colbert, the plan I have adopted is one worthy of a king," said Louis XIV., who pronounced these words with all the majesty he knew how to assume in such circumstances, and dismissed Colbert for the purpose of giving an audience to his tailors. The order issued by the king was known throughout the whole of Fontainebleau. It was already known, too, that the king was trying on his costume, and that the ballet would be danced in the evening. The news circulated with the rapidity of lightning. During its progress it kindled every variety of coquetry, desire, and wild ambition. At the same moment, as if by enchantment, every one who knew how to hold a needle, every one who could distinguish a coat from a pair of trousers, was summoned to the assistance of those who had received invitations. The king had completed his toilet by 9 o'clock.
He appeared in an open carriage decorated with branches of trees and flowers. The queens had taken their seats upon a magnificent dais or platform erected upon the borders of the lake, in a theatre of wonderful elegance of construction. In the space of 5 hours the carpenters had put together all the different parts connected with the building. The upholsterers had laid down the carpets, erected the seats, and, as if at the wave of an enchanter's wand, 1,000 arms, aiding instead of interfering with each other, had constructed the building amidst the sound of music, whilst at the same time other workmen illuminated the theatre and the shores of the lake with an incalculable number of lamps. As the heavens, set with stars, were perfectly unclouded, as not even a breath of air could be heard in the woods, and as if nature itself had yielded complacently to the king's fancies, the back of the theatre had been left open, so that behind the foreground of the scenes could be seen as a background the beautiful sky, glittering with stars, the sheet of water illuminated by the lights which were reflected in it, and the bluish outline of the grand masses of woods, with their rounded tops. When the king made his appearance, the theatre was full, and presented to the view one vast group, dazzling with gold and precious stones, in which, however, at the first glance, no single face could be distinguished. By degrees, as the sight became accustomed to so much brilliancy, the rarest beauties appear to the view, as in the evening sky the stars appear one by one to him who closes his eyes and then opens them again. The theatre represented a grove of trees. A few fawns lifting up their cloven feet were jumping about. A dryad made her appearance on the scene, and was immediately pursued by them. Others gathered round her for her defense, and they quarreled as they danced. Suddenly, for the purpose of restoring peace and order, Spring, accompanied by his whole court, made his appearance. The elements, subaltern powers of mythology, together with their attributes, hastened to follow their gracious sovereign. The seasons, allies of spring, followed him closely to form a quadrille, which, after many words of more or less flattering import, was the commencement of the dance. The music, hautboys, flutes, and viols, was delightfully descriptive of rural delights. The king had already made his appearance amid thunders of applause. He was dressed in a tunic of flowers, which set off his graceful and well-formed figure to advantage. His legs, the best shaped at court, were displayed to great advantage in flesh-colored silken hose, of silk so fine and so transparent that it seemed almost like flesh itself. The most beautiful pale lilac satin shoes, with bows of flowers and leaves, imprisoned his small feet. The bust of the figure was in harmonious keeping with the base. Louise's waving hair floated on his shoulders. The freshness of his complexion was enhanced by the brilliancy of his beautiful blue eyes, which softly kindled all hearts, a mouth with tempting lips, which deigned to open in smiles. Such was the prince of that period, justly that evening styled the king of all the loves. There was something in his carriage which resembled the buoyant movements of an immortal, and he did not dance so much as seem to soar along. His entrance produced, therefore, the most brilliant effect. Suddenly the Comte de Saint-Aignan was observed endeavoring to approach either the king or Madame. The princess, who was robed in a long dress, diaphanous and light as the finest network tissue from the hands of skillful Mechlin workers, one knee occasionally revealed beneath the folds of the tunic, and her little feet encased in silken slippers decked with pearls, advanced radiant with beauty, accompanied by her cortege of Bacchantes, and had already reached the spot assigned to her in the dance. The applause continued so long that the Comte had ample leisure to join the king. "What is the matter, Saint-Aignan?" said Spring. "Nothing whatever," replied the courtier, as pale as death. "But your Majesty has not thought of fruits." "Yes, it is suppressed." "Far from it, sire. Your Majesty having given no directions about it, the musicians have retained it." "How excessively annoying!" said the king. "This figure cannot be performed, since Monsieur de Guiche is absent. It must be suppressed." "Ah, sire, a quarter of an hour's music without any dancing will produce an effect so chilling as to ruin the success of the ballet. But come, since, oh, sire, it is not the greatest misfortune, for after all the orchestra could still just as well cut it out if it were necessary. But what? Why, Monsieur de Guiche is here." "Here?" replied the king, frowning. "Here? Are you sure?" "Yes, sire, and ready dressed for the ballet." The king felt himself color deeply, and said, "You are probably mistaken." "So little is that the case, sire, that if your Majesty will look to the right, you will see that the Comte is in waiting." Louis turned hastily toward the side, and in fact, on his right, brilliant in his character of Autumn, de Guiche waited until the king should look at him, in order that he might address him. To give an idea of the stupefaction of the king, and that of Monsieur, who was moving about restlessly in his box, to describe also the agitated movement of the heads in the theatre, and of the strange emotion of Madame at the sight of her partner, is a task we must leave to abler hands. The king stood almost gaping with astonishment as he looked at the Comte, who, bowing lowly, approached Louis with the profoundest respect. "Sire," he said, "your Majesty's most devoted servant approaches to perform a service on this occasion with similar zeal that he has already shown on the field of battle. Your Majesty, in omitting the dance of the fruits, would be losing the most beautiful scene in the ballet." "I did not wish to be the substance of so dark a shadow to your Majesty's elegance, skill, and graceful invention, and I have left my tenants in order to place my services at your Majesty's commands." Every word fell distinctly, in perfect harmony and eloquence, upon Louis XIV's ears. Their flattery pleased, as much as de Guiche's courage had astonished him, and he simply replied, "I did not tell you to return, Comte." "Certainly not, sire, but your Majesty did not tell me to remain." The king perceived that time was passing away, that if this strange scene were prolonged it would complicate everything, and that a single cloud upon the picture would eventually spoil the whole. Besides, the king's heart was filled with 2 or 3 new ideas. He had just derived fresh inspiration from the eloquent glances of Madame. Her look had said to him, "Since they are jealous of you, divide their suspicions, for the man who distrusts 2 rivals does not object to either in particular." So that Madame, by this clever diversion, decided him. The king smiled upon de Guiche, who did not comprehend a word of Madame's dumb language, but he remarked that she pretended not to look at him, and he attributed the pardon which had been conferred upon him to the princess's kindness of heart. The king seemed only pleased with everyone present. Monsieur was the only one who did not understand anything about the matter. The ballet began. The effect was more than beautiful. When the music, by its bursts of melody, carried away these illustrious dancers, when the simple, untutored pantomime of that period, only the more natural on account of the very indifferent acting of the august actors, had reached its culminating point of triumph, the theatre shook with tumultuous applause. De Guiche shone like the sun, but like a courtly sun that is resigned to fill a subordinate part. Disdainful of a success of which Madame showed no acknowledgment, he thought of nothing but boldly regaining the marked preference of the princess. She, however, did not bestow a single glance upon him. By degrees all his happiness, all his brilliancy, subsided into regret and uneasiness, so that his limbs lost their power, his arms hung heavily by his sides, and his head drooped as though he was stupefied. The king, who had from this moment become in reality the principal dancer in the quadrille, cast a look upon his vanquished rival. De Guiche soon ceased to sustain even the character of the courtier. Without applause he danced indifferently, and very soon could not dance at all, by which accident the triumph of the king and of Madame was assured. End of the Ballet of the Seasons. Recording by Bill Neeland.
of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Neeland. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. The Nymphs of the Park of Fontainebleau. The king remained for a moment to enjoy a triumph as complete as it could possibly be. He then turned towards Madame for the purpose of admiring her also a little in her turn. Young persons love with more vivacity, perhaps with greater ardor and deeper passion, than others more advanced in years. But all the other feelings are at the same time developed in proportion to their youth and vigor. So that vanity being with them almost always the equivalent of love, the latter feeling, according to the laws of equipoise, never attains that degree of perfection which it acquires in men and women from 30 to 5 and 30 years of age. Louis thought of Madame, but only after he had studiously thought of himself, and Madame carefully thought of herself, without bestowing a single thought upon the king. The victim, however, of all these royal affections and affectations was poor de Guiche. Every one could observe his agitation and prostration, a prostration which was, indeed, the more remarkable since people were not accustomed to see him with his arms hanging listlessly by his side, his head bewildered, and his eyes, with all their bright intelligence, bedimmed. It rarely happened that any uneasiness was excited on his account, whenever a question of elegance or taste was under discussion, and de Guiche's defeat was accordingly attributed by the greater number present to his courtier-like tact and ability. But there were others, keen-sighted observers are always to be met with at court, who remarked his paleness and his alerted looks, which he could neither feign nor conceal, and their conclusion was that de Guiche was not acting the part of a flatterer. All these sufferings, successes, and remarks were blended, confounded, and lost in the uproar of applause. When, however, the queens expressed their satisfaction, and the spectators their enthusiasm, when the king had retired to his dressing-room to change his costume, and whilst Monsieur, dressed as a woman, as he delighted to be, was in his turn dancing about, de Guiche, who had now recovered himself, approached Madame, who, seated at the back of the theatre, was waiting for the second part, and had quitted the others for the purpose of creating a sort of solitude for herself in the midst of the crowd, to meditate, as it were, beforehand, upon choreographic effects. And it will be perfectly understood that, absorbed in deep meditation, she did not see, or rather pretended not to notice, anything that was passing around her. De Guiche, observing that she was alone, near a thicket constructed of painted cloth, approached her. Two of her maids of honor, dressed as hamadryads, seeing de Guiche advance, drew back out of respect, whereupon de Guiche proceeded towards the middle of the circle and saluted her Royal Highness. But whether she did or did not observe his salutations, the princess did not even turn her head. A cold shiver passed through poor de Guiche. He was unprepared for such utter indifference, for he had neither seen nor been told of anything that had taken place, and consequently could guess nothing. Remarking, therefore, that his obseisance obtained him no acknowledgment, he advanced one step further, and in a voice which he tried, though vainly, to render calm, he said, "I have the honor to present my most humble respects to your Royal Highness." Upon this, Madame deigned to turn her eyes languishingly towards the Comte, observing, "Ah, Monsieur de Guiche, is that you? Good day." The Comte's patience almost forsook him, as he continued, "Your Royal Highness danced just now most charmingly." "Do you think so?" she replied with indifference. "Yes, the character which your Royal Highness assumed is in perfect harmony with your own." Madame again turned around, and, looking de Guiche full in the face with a bright and steady gaze, said, "Why so?" "Oh, there can be no doubt of it." "Explain yourself." "You represented a divinity, beautiful, disdainful, inconstant." "You mean Pomona, Comte?" "I allude to the goddess." Madame stood silent for a moment, with her lips compressed, and then observed, "But, Comte, You too are an excellent dancer. Nay, madame, I am only one of those who are never noticed, or who are soon forgotten if they ever happen to be noticed. With this remark, accompanied by one of those deep sighs which affect the remotest fibre of one's being, his heart burdened with sorrow and throbbing fast, his head on fire, and his gaze wandering, he bowed breathlessly, and withdrew behind the thicket. The only reply Madame condescended to make was by slightly raising her shoulders, and, as her ladies of honor had discreetly retired while the conversation lasted, she recalled them by a look. The ladies were Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente and Mademoiselle de Montalais. "Did you hear what the Comte de Guiche said?" the princess inquired. "No." "It really is very singular," she continued, in a compassionate tone, "how exile has affected poor Monsieur de Guiche's wit." And then, in a louder voice, fearful lest her unhappy victim might lose a syllable, she said, "In the first place, he danced badly, and afterwards his remarks were very silly." She then rose, humming the air to which she was presently going to dance. De Guiche had overheard everything. The arrow pierced his heart and wounded him mortally. Then, at the risk of interrupting the progress of the fête by his annoyance, he fled from the scene, tearing his beautiful costume of autumn in pieces, and scattering, as he went along, the branches of vines, mulberry, and almond trees with all the other artificial attributes of his assumed divinity. A quarter of an hour afterwards he returned to the theatre, but it will be readily believed that it was only a powerful effort of reason over his great excitement that enabled him to go back. Or perhaps, for love is thus strangely constituted, he found it impossible even to remain much longer separated from the presence of one who had broken his heart. Madame was finishing her figure. She saw, but did not look at De Guiche, who, irritated and revengeful, turned his back upon her as she passed him, escorted by her nymphs, and followed by 100 flatterers. During this time, at the other end of the theatre, near the lake, a young woman was seated, with her eyes fixed upon one of the windows of the theatre, from which were issuing streams of light, the window in question being that of the royal box. As De Guiche quitted the theatre for the purpose of getting into the fresh air he so much needed, he passed close to this figure and saluted her. When she perceived the young man, she rose, like a woman surprised in the midst of ideas she was desirous of concealing from herself. De Guiche stopped as he recognized her, and said hurriedly, "Good evening, Mademoiselle de la Vallière. I am indeed fortunate in meeting you." "I also, Monsieur de Guiche, am glad of this accidental meeting," said the young girl as she was about to withdraw. "Pray do not leave me," said De Guiche, stretching out his hand towards her, "for you would be contradicting the kind words you have just pronounced. Remain, I implore you. The evening is most lovely. You wish to escape from the merry tumult, and prefer your own society. Well, I can understand it. All women who are possessed of any feeling do, and one never finds them dull or lonely when removed from the giddy vortex of these exciting amusements. Oh, heaven!" he exclaimed suddenly. "What is the matter, Monsieur le Comte?" inquired La Vallière, with some anxiety. "You seem agitated." "Oh, no. Will you allow me, Monsieur de Guiche, to return you the thanks I had proposed to offer you on the very first opportunity? It is to your recommendation, I am aware, that I owe my admission among the number of Madame's maids of honor." "Indeed? I remember now, and I congratulate myself. Do you love anyone?" "I!" exclaimed La Vallière. "Forgive me, I hardly know what I am saying. 1,000 times forgive me. Madame was right, quite right. This brutal exile has completely turned my brain." "And yet it seemed to me that the king received you with kindness." "Do you think so? Received me with kindness? Perhaps so, yes." "There cannot be a doubt he received you kindly, for, in fact, you returned without his permission." "Quite true, and I believe you are right. But have you not seen Monsieur de Bragelonne here?" La Vallière started at the name. "Why do you ask?" she inquired.
"Have I offended you again?" said De Guiche. "In that case I am indeed unhappy, and greatly to be pitied." "Yes, very unhappy, and very much to be pitied, Monsieur de Guiche, for you seem to be suffering terribly. Oh, mademoiselle, why have I not a devoted sister or a true friend such as yourself?" "You have friends, Monsieur de Guiche, and the Vicomte de Bragelonne, of whom you spoke just now, is, I believe, one of the most devoted."
Yes, yes, you are right. He is one of my best friends. Farewell, Mademoiselle de Vallier, farewell." And he fled like one possessed along the banks of the lake. His dark shadow glided, lengthening as it disappeared, among the illumined hues and glittering undulations of the water. La Valliere looked after him, saying, "Yes, yes, he too is suffering, and I begin to understand why." She had hardly finished when her companions, Mademoiselle de Montalais and Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, ran forward. They were released from their attendants, and had changed their costumes of nymphs. Delighted with the beautiful night and the success of the evening, they returned to look after their companion. "What, already here?" they said to her. "We thought we should be first at the rendezvous." "I have been here this quarter of an hour," replied La Valliere. "Did not the dancing amuse you?" "No." "But surely the enchanting spectacle?" "No more than the dancing. As far as beauty is concerned, I much prefer that which these dark woods present, in whose depths can be seen, now in one direction and again in another, a light passing by, as though it were an eye, in color like a midnight rainbow, sometimes open, at others closed." "La Valliere is quite a poetess," said Tonnay-Charente. "In other words," said Montalais, "she is insupportable. Whenever there is a question of laughing a little, or of amusing ourselves, La Valliere begins to cry. Whenever we girls have reason to cry, because perhaps we have mislaid our dresses, or because our vanity has been wounded, or our costume fails to produce an effect, La Valliere laughs." "As far as I am concerned, that is not my character," said Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente. "I am a woman, and there are few like me. Whoever loves me flatters me. Whoever flatters me pleases me. And whoever pleases—" "Well," said Montalais, "you do not finish." "It is too difficult," replied Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, laughing loudly. "Do you, who are so clever, finish for me?" "And you, Louise," said Montalais, "does anyone please you?" "This is a matter that concerns no one but myself," replied the young girl, rising from the mossy bank on which she had been reclining during the whole time the ballet lasted. "Now, mademoiselle, we have agreed to amuse ourselves tonight without anyone to overlook us, and without any escort. We are 3 in number, we like one another, and the night is lovely. Look yonder, do you not see the moon slowly rising, silvering the topmost branches of the chestnuts and the oaks? Oh, beautiful walk, sweet liberty, exquisite soft turf of the woods, the happiness which your friendship confers upon me! Let us walk arm in arm toward these large trees. Out yonder all are at this moment seated at table and fully occupied, or preparing to adorn themselves for a set and formal promenade. Horses are being saddled, or harnessed to the carriages, the Queen's mules or Madame's 4 white ponies. As for ourselves, we shall soon reach some retired spot where no eyes can see us, and no step follow ours. Do you not remember, Montalais, the woods of Cheverny and of Chambord, the innumerable rustling poplars of Blois, where we exchanged our mutual hopes? And confidences, too?" "Yes." "Well," said Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, "I also think a good deal, but I take care—" "To say nothing," said Montalais, "so that when Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente thinks, Athénée is the only one who knows it." "Hush!" said Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente. "I hear steps approaching from this side." "Quick, quick, then, among the high reed grass," said Montalais. "Stoop, Athénée, you are so tall." Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente stooped as she was told, and almost at the same time they saw 2 gentlemen approaching, their heads bent down, walking arm in arm on the fine gravel walk running parallel with the bank.
The young girls had indeed made themselves small, indeed invisible. "It is Monsieur de Guiche," whispered Montalais in Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charent's ear. "It is Monsieur de Bragelonne," whispered the latter to La Valliere. The two young men approached still closer, conversing in animated tones. "She was here just now," said the Count. "If I had only seen her, I should have declared it to be a vision, but I spoke to her." "You are positive, then?" "Yes, but perhaps I frightened her." "In what way?" "Oh, I was still half crazy at you know what, so that she could hardly have understood what I was saying, and must have grown alarmed." "Oh," said Bragelonne, "do not make yourself uneasy. She is all kindness, and will excuse you. She is clear-sighted, and will understand." "Yes, but if she should have understood, and understood too well, she may talk." "You do not know Louise, Count," said Raoul. "Louise possesses every virtue and has not a single fault." And the two young men passed on, and as they proceeded, their voices were soon lost in the distance. "How is it, La Valliere," said Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, "that the Vicomte de Bragelonne spoke of you as Louise?" "We were brought up together," replied Louise, blushing. "Monsieur de Bragelonne has honored me by asking my hand in marriage, but—" "Well?" "It seems the king will not consent to it." "Eh? Why the king? And what has the king to do with it?" exclaimed R. sharply. "Good gracious, has the king any right to interfere in matters of that kind? Politics are politics, as Monsieur de Mazarin used to say, but love is love. If, therefore, you love Monsieur de Bragelonne, marry him. I give my consent." Athene began to laugh. "Oh, I am speaking seriously," replied Montalais, "and my opinion in this case is quite as good as the king's, I suppose. Is it not, Louise?" "Come," said La Valliere, "these gentlemen have passed. Let us take advantage of our being alone to cross the open ground and so take refuge in the woods." "So much the better," said Athene, "because I see the torches setting out from the chateau and the theatre, and they seem as if they were preceding some person of distinction." "Let us run, then," said all three, and gracefully lifting up the long skirts of their silk dresses, they lightly ran across the open space between the lake and the thickest covert of the park. Montalais, agile as a deer, Athene, eager as a young wolf, bounded through the dry grass, and now and then some bold Actaeon might, by the aid of the faint light, have perceived their straight and well-formed limbs somewhat displayed beneath the heavy folds of their satin petticoats. La Valliere, more refined and more bashful, allowed her dress to flow around her, retarded also by the lameness of her foot. It was not long before she called out to her companions to halt, and, left behind, she obliged them both to wait for her. At this moment a man, concealed in a dry ditch planted with young willow saplings, scrambled quickly up its shelving side and ran off in the direction of the chateau. The three young girls, on their side, reached the outskirts of the park, every path of which they well knew. The ditches were bordered by high hedges full of flowers, which on that side protected the foot passengers from being intruded upon by the horses and carriages. In fact, the sound of Madame's and the Queen's carriages could be heard in the distance upon the hard, dry ground of the roads, followed by the mountain cavaliers. Distant music reached them in response, and when the soft notes died away, the nightingale, with throat of pride, poured forth his melodious chants, and his most complicated, learned, and sweetest compositions to those who had met beneath the thick covert of the woods. Near the songster, in the dark background of the large trees, could be seen the glistening eyes of an owl, attracted by the harmony. In this way, the fête of the whole court was a fête also for the mysterious inhabitants of the forest, for certainly the deer in the brake, the pheasant on the branch, the fox in its hole, were all listening. One could realize the life led by this nocturnal and invisible population from the restless movements that suddenly took place among the leaves. Our sylvan nymphs uttered a slight cry, but, reassured immediately afterwards, they laughed and resumed their walk. In this manner they reached the royal oak, the venerable relic of a tree which in its prime had listened to the sighs of Henry II for the beautiful Diana of Poitiers, and later still to those of Henry IV for the lovely Gabrielle d'Estrées. Beneath this oak the gardeners had piled up the moss and turf in such a manner that never had a seat more luxuriously rested the wearied limbs of man or monarch. The trunk, somewhat rough to recline against, was sufficiently large to accommodate the three young girls, whose voices were lost among the branches, which stretched upwards to the sky.
End of The Nymphs of the Park of Fontainebleau. Recording by Bill Neeland.
Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 41. What was said under the royal oak. The softness of the air, the stillness of the foliage, tacitly imposed upon these young girls an engagement to change immediately their giddy conversation for one of a more serious character. She, indeed, whose disposition was the most lively, Montalais, for instance, was the first to yield to the influence, and she began by heaving a deep sigh, and saying, "What happiness to be here alone, and at liberty, with every right to be frank, especially towards one another." "Yes," said Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, "for the court, however brilliant it may be, has always some falsehood concealed beneath the folds of its velvet robes, or the glitter of its diamonds." "I," replied La Valliere, "I never tell a falsehood. When I cannot speak the truth, I remain silent." "You will not long remain in favor," said Montalais. "It is not here as it was in Blois, where we told the dowager Madame all our little annoyances, and all our longings. There were certain days when Madame remembered that she herself had been young, and, on those days, whoever talked with her found in her a sincere friend. She related to us her flirtations with Monsieur, and we told her the flirtations she had had with others, or at least, the rumors of them that had spread abroad. Poor woman, so simple-minded, she laughed at them, as we did. Where is she now?" "Ah, Montalais, laughter-loving Montalais," cried La Valliere, "you see you are sighing again; the woods inspire you, and you are almost reasonable this evening." "You ought not, either of you," said Athenais, "to regret the court at Blois so much, unless you do not feel happy with us. A court is a place where men and women resort to talk of matters which mothers, guardians, and especially confessors, severely denounce." "Oh, Athenais," said Louise, blushing. "Athenais is frank tonight," said Montalais; "let us avail ourselves of it." "Yes, let us take advantage of it, for this evening I could divulge the softest secrets of my heart." "Ah, if Monsieur Montespan were here," said Montalais. "Do you mean that I care for Monsieur de Montespan?" murmured the beautiful young girl. "He is handsome, I believe." "Yes, and that is no small advantage in my eyes." "There now, you see. I will go further, and say that of all the men whom one sees here, he is the handsomest, and the most—" "What was that?" said La Valliere, starting suddenly from the mossy bank. "A deer hurrying by, perhaps." "I am only afraid of men," said Athenais, "when they do not resemble Monsieur de Montespan." "A truce to raillery. Monsieur de Montespan is attentive to me, but that does not commit me in any way. Is not Monsieur de Guiche here, he who is so devoted to Madame?" "Poor fellow!" said La Valliere. "Why to be pitied? Madame is sufficiently beautiful, and of high enough rank, I suppose." La Valliere shook her head sorrowfully, saying, "When one loves, it is neither beauty nor rank; when one loves, it should be the heart, or the eyes only, of him or of her whom one loves." Montalais began to laugh loudly. "Heart, eyes," she said, "oh, sugar plums!" "I speak for myself," replied La Valliere. "Noble sentiments," said Athenais, with an air of protection, but with indifference. "Are they not your own?" asked Louise. "Perfectly so; but to continue, how can one pity a man who bestows his attentions upon such a woman as Madame? If any disproportion exists, it is on the count's side." "Oh, no, no," returned La Valliere, "it is on Madame's side." "Explain yourself." "I will. Madame has not even a wish to know what love is. She diverts herself with the feeling, as children do with fireworks, from which a spark might set a palace on fire. It makes a display, and that is all she cares about. Besides, pleasure forms a tissue of which she wishes her life to be woven. Monsieur le Guiche loves this illustrious personage, but she will never love him." Athenais laughed disdainfully. "Do people really ever love?" she said. "Where are the noble sentiments you just now uttered? Does not a woman's virtue consist in the uncompromising refusal of every intrigue that might compromise her? A properly regulated woman, endowed with a natural heart, ought to look at men, make herself loved, adored even by them, and say at the very utmost but once in her life, 'I begin to think that I ought not to have been what I am. I should have detested this one less than others.'" "Therefore," exclaimed La Valliere, "that is what M. Montespan has to expect. Certainly. He as well as every one else. What! Have I not said that I admit he possesses a certain superiority, and would not that be enough? My dear child, a woman is a queen during the entire period nature permits her to enjoy sovereign power, from 15 to 35 years of age. After that, we are free to have a heart, when we only have that left." "Oh, oh," murmured La Valliere. "Excellent!" cried Montalais; "a very masterful woman. Athenais, you will make your way in the world. Do you not approve of what I say?" "Completely," replied her laughing companion. "You are not serious, Montalais?" said Louise. "Yes, yes, I approve everything Athenais has just said, only—" "Only what?" "Well, I cannot carry it out. I have the firmest principles. I form resolutions beside which the laws of Stadtholder and the king of Spain are child's play; but when the moment arrives to put them into execution, nothing comes of them." "Your courage fails?" said Athenais, scornfully. "Miserably so." "Great weakness of nature," returned Athenais; "but at least you make a choice." "Why, no; it pleases fate to disappoint me in everything. I dream of emperors, and I find only—" "Ore, ore!" exclaimed La Valliere; "for pity's sake, do not, for the pleasure of saying something witty, sacrifice those who love you with such devoted affection." "Oh, I do not trouble myself much about that. Those who love me are sufficiently happy that I do not dismiss them altogether. So much the worse for myself if I have a weakness for any one, but so much the worse for others if I revenge myself upon them for it." "You are right," said Athenais, "and perhaps you too will reach the goal. In other words, young ladies, that is termed being a coquette. Men, who are very silly in most things, are particularly so in confounding, under the terms of coquetry, a woman's pride, and love of changing her sentiments as she does her dress. I, for instance, am proud, that is to say, impregnable. I treat my admirers harshly, but without any pretension to retain them. Men call me a coquette, because they are vain enough to think I care for them. Other women, Montalais, for instance, have allowed themselves to be influenced by flattery. They would be lost were it not for that most fortunate principle of instinct, which urges them to change suddenly, and punish the man whose devotion they so recently accepted." "A very learned dissertation," said Montalais, in a tone of thorough enjoyment. "It is odious," murmured Louise. "Thanks to that sort of coquetry, for, indeed, that is genuine coquetry," continued Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, "the lover who, a little while since, was puffed up with pride, in a minute afterwards is suffering at every pore of his vanity and self-esteem. He was, perhaps, already beginning to assume the airs of a conqueror, but now he retreats defeated. He was about to assume an air of protection towards us, but he is obliged to prostrate himself once more. The result of all this is, that, instead of having a husband who is jealous and troublesome, free from restraint in his conduct towards us, we have a lover always trembling in our presence, always fascinated by our attractions, always submissive, and for this simple reason, that he finds the same woman never twice of the same mind. Be convinced, therefore, of the advantages of coquetry. Possessing that, one reigns a queen among women in cases where Providence has withheld that precious faculty of holding one's heart and mind in check." "How clever you are," said Montalais, "and how well you understand the duty women owe themselves." "I am only settling a case of individual happiness," said Athenais modestly, "and defending myself, like all weak, loving dispositions, against the oppressions of the stronger." La Valliere does not say a word. Does she not approve of what we are saying? "Nay, only I do not understand it," said Louise. "You talk like people not called upon to live in this world of ours." "And very pretty your world is," said Montalais. "A world," returned Athenais, "in which men worship woman until she is fallen, and insult her when she has fallen." "Who spoke to you of falling?" said Louise. "Yours is a new theory, then. Will you tell us how you intend to resist yielding to temptation, if you allow yourself to be hurried away by feelings of affection?" "Oh!" exclaimed the young girl, raising towards the dark heavens her beautiful large eyes filled with tears, "if you did but know what a heart is, I would explain, and convince you. A loving heart is stronger than all your coquetry, more powerful than all your pride. A woman is never truly loved, I believe. A man never loves with idolatry, unless he feels sure he is loved in return. Let old men, whom we read of in comedies, fancy themselves adored by coquettes. A young man is conscious of, and knows them. If he has a fancy, or a strong desire, and an absorbing passion for a coquette, he cannot mistake her. A coquette may drive him out of his senses, but will never make him fall in love. Love, such as I conceive it to be, is an incessant, complete, and perfect sacrifice; but it is not the sacrifice of one only of the two persons thus united; it is the perfect abnegation of two who are desirous of blending their beings into one. If ever I love, I shall implore my lover to leave me free and pure. I will tell him, and he will understand, that my heart was torn by my refusal, and he, in his love for me, aware of the magnitude of my sacrifice, he, in his turn, I say, will store his devotion for me, will respect me, and will not seek my ruin, to insult me when I have fallen, as you said just now, while uttering your blasphemies against love, such as I understand it. That is my idea of love. And now you will tell me, perhaps, that my love will despise me. I defy him to do so, unless he be the vilest of men, and my heart assures me that it is not such a man I would choose. A look from me will repay him for the sacrifices he makes, or will inspire him with the virtues which he would never think he possessed." "But, Louise," exclaimed Montalais, "you tell us this, and do not carry it into practice." "What do you mean?" "You are adored by Raoul de Bragelonne, who worships you on both knees. The poor fellow is made the victim of your virtue, just as he would be, nay, more than he would be even, of my coquetry, or Athenæus's pride." "All this is simply a different shade of coquetry," said Athenæus, "and Louise, I perceive, is a coquette without knowing it." "Oh!" said La Valliere. "Yes, you may call it instinct if you please, keenest sensibility, exquisite refinement of feeling, perpetual play of restrained outbreaks of affection, which end in smoke. It is very artful, too, and very effective. I should even, now that I reflect upon it, have preferred this system of tactics to my own pride, for waging war on members of the other sex, because it offers the advantage sometimes of thoroughly convincing them. But at the present moment, without utterly condemning myself, I declare it to be superior to the non-complex coquetry of Montalais." And the two young girls began to laugh. La Valliere alone preserved silence, and quietly shook her head. Then, a moment after, she added, "If you were to tell me, in the presence of a man, but a fourth part of what you have now just said, or even if I were assured that you think it, I should die of shame and grief where I am now." "Very well, die, poor tender little darling," replied Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente; "for if there are no men here, there are at least two women, your own friends, who declare you to be attainted and convicted of being a coquette from instinct; in other words, the most dangerous kind of coquette the world possesses." "Oh, mesdemoiselles!" replied La Valliere, blushing, and almost ready to weep. Her two companions again burst out laughing. "Very well, I will tell Bragelonne to tell me." "Bragelonne?" said Athenæus. "Yes, Bragelonne, who is as courageous as Caesar, and as clever and witty as M. Fouquet. Poor fellow, for 12 years he has known you, loved you, and yet, one can hardly believe it, he has never even kissed the tips of your fingers." "Tell us the reason of this cruelty, you who are all heart," said Athenæus to La Valliere. "Let me explain it by a single word, virtue. You will perhaps deny the existence of virtue?" "Come, Louise, tell us the truth," said Aure, taking her by the hand. "What do you wish me to tell you?" cried La Valliere. "Whatever you like; but it will be useless for you to say anything, for I persist in my opinion of you, a coquette from instinct; in other words, as I have already said, and I say it again, the most dangerous of all coquettes." "Oh, no, no! For pity's sake, do not believe that." "What, 12 years of extreme severity? How can that be, since 12 years ago I was only 5 years old? The frivolity of the child cannot surely be placed to the young girl's account." "Well, you are now 17, 3 years instead of 12. During those 3 years you have remained constantly and unchangeably cruel. Against you are arrayed the silent shades of Blois, the meetings when you diligently conned the stars together, the evening wanderings beneath the plantain trees, his impassioned 20 years speaking to your 14 summers, the fire of his glances addressed to yourself. Yes, yes, but so it is. Impossible! But why impossible? Tell us something credible, and we will believe you. Yet, if you were to suppose one thing. What is that? Suppose that I thought I was in love, and that I am not. What, not in love? Well, then, if I have acted in a different manner to what others do when they are in love, it is because I do not love, because my hour has not yet come. Louise, Louise, said Montalais, take care, or I will remind you of the remark you made just now. Raoul is not here, do not overwhelm him while he is absent. Be charitable, and if, on closer inspection, you think you do not love him, tell him so, poor fellow. And she began to laugh. Louise pitied Monsieur de Guiche just now, said Athenais. Would it be possible to detect an explanation of her indifference for the one, in this compassion for the other? Say what you please, said La Valliere, sadly. Upbraid me as you like, since you do not understand me. Oh, oh, replied Montalais, temper, sorrow, tears. We are jesting, Louise, and are not, I assure you, quite the monsters you suppose. Look at the proud Athenais, as she is called. She does not love Monsieur de Montespan, it is true, but she would be in despair if Monsieur de Montespan did not continue to love her. Look at me. I laugh at Monsieur Malicorne, but the poor fellow whom I laugh at knows precisely when he will be permitted to press his lips upon my hand. And yet the eldest of us is not 20 yet. What a future before us! Silly, silly girls, murmured Louise. You are quite right, said Montalais, and you alone have spoken words of wisdom. Certainly. I do not dispute it, replied Athenais. And so it is clear you do not love poor Monsieur de Bragelonne. Perhaps she does, said Montalais. She is not yet quite certain of it. But, in any case, listen, Athenais. If Monsieur de Bragelonne is ever free, I will give you a little friendly advice. What is that? To look at him well before you decide in favor of Monsieur de Montespan. Oh, in that way of considering the subject, Monsieur de Bragelonne is not the only one whom one could look at with pleasure. Monsieur de Guiche, for instance, has his value also. He did not distinguish himself this evening, said Montalais, and I know from very good authority that Madame thought him insupportable. Monsieur de Saint Aignan produced a most brilliant effect, and I am sure that more than one person who saw him dance this evening will not soon forget him. Do you not think so, La Valliere? Why do you ask me? I did not see him, nor do I know him. What! You did not see Monsieur de Saint Aignan? Don't you know him? No. Come, come, do not affect a virtue more extravagantly excessive than our vanity. You have eyes, I suppose. Excellent. Then you must have seen all those who danced this evening. Yes, nearly all. That is a very impertinent nearly all for somebody. You must take it for what it is worth. Very well. Now, among all those gentlemen whom you saw, which do you prefer? Yes, said Montalais. Is it Monsieur de Saint Aignan, or Monsieur de Guiche, or I prefer no one, and I thought them all about the same. Do you mean, then, that among that brilliant assembly, the first court in the world, no one pleased you? I did not say that. Tell us, then, who your ideal is. It is not an ideal being. He exists, then? In very truth, exclaimed La Valliere, aroused and excited, I cannot understand you at all. What, you who have a heart as I have, eyes as I have, and yet you speak of Monsieur de Guiche, of Monsieur Saint Aignan, when the king was there? These words, uttered in a precipitate manner, and in an agitated, fervid tone of voice, made her two companions, between whom she was seated, exclaim in a manner that terrified her, "The king!" La Valliere buried her face in her hands. "Yes," she murmured, "the king! The king! Have you ever seen any one to be compared to the king?" "You were right just now in saying you had excellent eyes, Louise, for you see a great distance, too far, indeed. Alas! the king is not one upon whom our poor eyes have a right to hinge themselves." "That is too true," cried La Valliere. "It is not the privilege of all eyes to gaze upon the sun. But I will look upon him, even were I to be blinded in doing so." At this moment, and as though caused by the words which had just escaped La Valliere's lips, a rustling of leaves, and of what sounded like some silken material, was heard behind the adjoining bushes. The young girls hastily rose, almost terrified out of their senses. They distinctly saw the leaves move, without being able to see what it was that stirred them. "It is a wolf, or a wild boar!" cried Montalais. "Fly, fly!" The three girls, in the extremity of terror, fled by the first path that presented itself, and did not stop until they had reached the verge of the wood. There, breathless, leaning against each other, feeling their hearts throb wildly, they endeavored to collect their senses, but could only succeed in doing so after the lapse of some minutes. Perceiving at last the lights from the windows of the chateau, they decided to walk towards them. La Valliere was exhausted with fatigue, and Aure and Athenais were obliged to support her. "We have escaped well," said Montalais. "I am greatly afraid," said La Valliere, "that it was something worse than a wolf. For my part, and I speak as I think, I should have preferred to have run the risk of being devoured alive by some wild animal, than to have been listened to and overheard. Fool, fool that I am! How could I have thought, how could I have said what I did?" And saying this, her head bowed like the water-tossed plume of a bulrush. She felt her limbs fail, and her strength abandoning her, and gliding almost inanimate from the arms of her companions, sank down upon the turf. Chapter 41. Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 42. The King's Uneasiness. Let us leave poor La Valliere, who had fainted in the arms of her two companions, and return to the precincts of the Royal Oak. The young girls had hardly run 20 paces when the sound which so much alarmed them was renewed among the branches. A man's figure might indistinctly be perceived, and putting the branches of the bushes aside, he appeared upon the verge of the wood, and perceiving that the place was empty, burst out into a peal of laughter. It is almost superfluous to add that the form in question was that of the young and handsome cavalier, who immediately made a sign to another, who thereupon made his appearance. "What, sire," said the second figure, advancing timidly, "has your majesty put our young sentimentalists to flight?" "It seems so," said the king, "and you can show yourself without fear. Take care, sire, you will be recognized. But I tell you they are flown." "This is a most fortunate meeting, sire, and if I dared offer an opinion to your majesty, we ought to follow them. They are far enough away by this time. They would quickly allow themselves to be overtaken, especially if they knew who were following them." "What do you mean by that, coxcomb that you are?" "Why, one of them seems to have taken a fancy to me, and another compared you to the sun. The greater reason why we should not show ourselves, Saint Aignan. The sun never shows itself in the night time." "Upon my word, sire, your majesty seems to have very little curiosity. In your place, I should like to know who are the two nymphs, the two dryads, the two hamadryads, who have so good an opinion of us. I shall know them again well enough, I assure you, without running after them." "By what means?" "By their voices, of course. They belong to the court, and the one who spoke of me had a remarkably sweet voice." "Ah, your majesty permits yourself to be influenced by flattery." "No one will ever say it is a means you make use of." "Forgive my stupidity, sire." "Come, let us go and look where I told you." "Is the passion, then, which your majesty confided to me, already forgotten?" "Oh, no, indeed. How is it possible to forget such beautiful eyes as Mademoiselle de la Valliere has?" "Yet the other one has a beautiful voice." "Which one?" "The lady who has fallen in love with the sun, M. de Saint Aignan." "Forgive me, sire." "Well, I am not sorry you should believe me to be an admirer of sweet voices as well as of beautiful eyes. I know you to be a terrible talker, and tomorrow I shall have to pay for the confidence I have shown you." "What do you mean, sire?" "That tomorrow every one will know that I have designs upon this little La Valliere. But be careful, Saint Aignan. I have confided my secret to no one but you, and if any one should speak to me about it, I shall know who has betrayed my secret." "You are angry, sire?" "No, but you understand I do not wish to compromise the poor girl." "Do not be afraid, sire." "You promise me, then?" "I give you my word of honor." "Excellent," thought the king, laughing to himself. "Now every one will know to morrow that I have been running about after La Valliere to night." Then, endeavoring to see where he was, he said, "Why have we lost ourselves?" "Not quite so bad as that, sire." "Where does that gate lead to?" "To Rond Point, sire." "Where we were going when we heard the sound of women's voices?" "Yes, sire, and the termination of a conversation in which I had the honor of hearing my own name pronounced by the side of your majesty's." You return to that subject too frequently, Saint Aignan." "Your majesty will forgive me, but I am delighted to know that a woman exists whose thoughts are occupied about me, without my knowledge, and without my having done anything to deserve it. Your majesty cannot comprehend that satisfaction, for your rank and merit attract attention, and compel regard." "No, no, Saint Aignan, believe me or not, as you like," said the king, leaning familiarly upon Saint Aignan's arm and taking the path he thought would lead them to the chateau. "But this candid confession, this perfectly disinterested preference of one who will, perhaps, never attract my attention, in one word, the mystery of this adventure excites me, and the truth is, that if I were not so taken with La Valliere—" "Do not let that interfere with your majesty's intentions; you have time enough before you." "What do you mean?" "La Valliere is said to be very strict in her ideas." "You excite my curiosity, and I am anxious to see her again. Come, let us walk on." The king spoke untruly, for nothing, on the contrary, could make him less anxious; but he had a part to play, and so he walked on hurriedly. Saint Aignan followed him at a short distance. Suddenly the king stopped. The courtier followed his example. "Saint Aignan," he said, "do you not hear some one moaning?" "Yes, sire, and weeping too, it seems." "It is in this direction," said the king. "It sounds like the tears and sobs of a woman." "Run!" said the king, and following a bypath, they ran across the grass. As they approached, the cries were more distinctly heard. "Help! help!" exclaimed two voices. The king and his companion redoubled their speed, and as they approached nearer, the sighs they had heard were changed into loud sobs. The cry of "Help! help!" was again repeated, at the sound of which the king and Saint Aignan increased the rapidity of their pace. Suddenly, at the other side of a ditch, under the branches of a willow, they perceived a woman on her knees, holding another in her arms who seemed to have fainted. A few paces from them a third, standing in the middle of the path, was calling for assistance. Perceiving the two gentlemen, whose rank she could not tell, her cries for assistance were redoubled. The king, who was in advance of his companion, leaped across the ditch, and reached the group at the very moment when, from the end of the path which led to the chateau, a dozen persons were approaching, who had been drawn to the spot by the same cries that had attracted the attention of the king and M. de Saint Aignan. "What is the matter, young ladies?" said Louis. "The king!" exclaimed Mademoiselle de Montalais, in her astonishment letting La Valliere's head fall upon the ground. "Yes, it is the king; but that is no reason why you should abandon your companion. Who is she?" "It is Mademoiselle de la Valliere, sire." "Mademoiselle de la Valliere?" "Yes, sire; she has just fainted." "Poor child!" said the king. "Quick, quick, fetch a surgeon." But however great the anxiety with which the king had pronounced these words may have seemed to others, he had not so carefully schooled himself but that they appeared, as well as the gesture which accompanied them, somewhat cold to Saint Aignan, to whom the king had confided the sudden love with which he had inspired him. "Saint Aignan," continued the king, "watch over Mademoiselle de la Valliere, I beg. Send for a surgeon. I will hasten forward and inform Madame of the accident which has befallen one of her maids of honor." And, in fact, while M. de Saint Aignan was busily engaged in making preparations for carrying Mademoiselle de la Valliere to the chateau, the king hurried forward, happy to have an opportunity of approaching Madame, and of speaking to her under a colorable pretext. Fortunately, a carriage was passing. The coachman was told to stop, and the persons who were inside, having been informed of the accident, eagerly gave up their seats to Mademoiselle de la Valliere. The current of fresh air produced by the rapid motion of the carriage soon recalled her to her senses. Having reached the chateau, she was able, though very weak, to alight from the carriage, and, with the assistance of Athenais and Montalais, to reach the inner apartments. They made her sit down in one of the rooms on the ground floor. After a while, as the accident had not produced much effect upon those who had been walking, the promenade was resumed. During this time, the king had found Madame beneath a tree with overhanging branches, and had seated himself by her side. "Take care, sire," said Henrietta to him in a low tone; "you do not show yourself as indifferent as you ought to be." "Alas!" said the king, in the same tone, "I much fear we have entered into an agreement above our strength to keep." He then added aloud, "You have heard of the accident, I suppose?" "What accident?" "Oh! in seeing you I forgot I hurried here expressly to tell you of it. I am, however, painfully affected by it. One of your maids of honor, Mademoiselle de la Valliere, has just fainted." "Indeed, poor girl!" said the princess, quietly. "What was the cause of it?" She then added in an undertone, "You forget, sire, that you wish others to believe in your passion for this girl, and yet you remain here while she is almost dying, perhaps, elsewhere." "Ah, madame," said the king, sighing, "how much more perfect you are in your part than I am, and how actively you think of everything." He then rose, saying loud enough for every one to hear him, "Permit me to leave you, madame. My uneasiness is very great, and I wish to be quite certain, myself, that proper attention has been given to Mademoiselle de la Valliere." And the king left again to return to La Valliere, while those who had been present commented upon the king's remark, "My uneasiness is very great." Chapter 42. Recording by Todd.